All right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming to the kickoff of our student essay contest. My name is Valerie Gomez. I'm the program manager for student engagement. So the way that this is going to work is for the first half of the session, we're going to just kind of talk about the contest in general. And then we have Justin here from the Tech Policy Press who will introduce himself and his role a little bit more. And then the second half, we're going to be doing a writing gym. We understand that this is during the lunch hour. We understand that people may have to go. Just know this first half is going to be recorded, and the second half is really this exercise opportunity. So whether you've come with all the ideas or none of the ideas, we have prompts for each of those. Just to give you a little bit of history about this, we've had a lot of people from the Berkman Klein Center in general submit to Tech Policy Press and have things published by them. And our executive director, Alex, spoke with Justin and thought it would be a great idea to get students' perspectives on a variety of subjects. So it is now officially on the website as well. So on our website, if you go onto the left side under programs and go to student writing, the student essay contest details are actually on there. And they have the topics and the parameters. And so from now until March 22nd, you will have an opportunity to think through specific topics and ideas and submissions for the contest itself. So we'll, again, spend all the time kind of talking through the contest a little bit more and then answering those frequently asked questions. And then we'll go into the writing gym. I'll pause there if anybody has any questions about what we're doing today. Our second half, as I said, that writing gym is going to be facilitated by our student engagement RA, Ami. She's chewing, so I'm not going to interrupt her to introduce herself. And she will definitely introduce herself after, so I don't put her on the spot. And but before I pass it over to Justin, am I missing anything else, Ami?
No, let's go.
Great. And so I am really pleased to introduce Justin Hendricks here. It has been such a pleasure to work in collaboration with Justin as we've talked through not only what Tech Policy Press publishes on their websites, but how we could overlap with BKC. And one of the things that I really loved in this contest is Justin's desire for Tech Policy Press to get the student perspective. We know that AI has been around for longer than the tools have been around, but the world has now caught up. And so what does that really look like in the classroom? What does that look like you having a relationship with a technology that's also a tool, that's also perhaps a companion, TBD, all of these things. And also, what is that experience like, each year? In research especially, I remember there was the day where it was like, make sure that it's not older than 5 years. And that's just not reasonable anymore. Something 5 years ago, especially in AI, is really tough, and things are just going really fast. So it's really exciting for us to be able to partner with them and to have student voice be on their platform. So I'll pause there and hand it over to Justin to introduce yourself and stop the presentation so you can also project your slides.
Great. Well, thank you, Valerie. I appreciate it. And I hope you all are warm and fed where you're at. And I'm grateful that you've taken the time out of your day to come and learn about this opportunity. And I'm going to spend a little time. I'll just give you a little quick background on myself and on Tech Policy Press, and then also talk a little bit about just some best practices that may be useful to you for this contest, but also maybe more generally as you think about how to communicate around topics at the intersection of tech and society, kind of going forward. So let me throw up a couple of slides here and go ahead and hit play. So hopefully everyone can see this. Just quickly about me, I have been in and around media and technology for a long time now, beginning to show my years a bit. But I started my career some time ago at The Economist. I was there for about a dozen years, and that was my kind of first entry point into media and journalism. I did a bunch of different jobs there, mostly focused on kind of product development, digital product development, and had a lot of fun learning about really how a global news organization works, but also, of course, being exposed to issues at the intersection of kind of policy and politics. And over the years, I got interested in technology. I went back to graduate school, studied tech, and ended up running a consortium at NYU that was focused on emerging media technology called New York City Media Lab. Um, Worked there with a bunch of different media companies in New York, including the New York Times and Bloomberg and the Associated Press and a range of others. And back then, we were doing a lot of thinking, in particular, about machine learning and big data and how that might change the media. Those were the kind of topics du jour at that time. And in the course of doing that, I also started teaching. And now I still teach at Cornell Tech here in New York City, as well as at NYU. And I teach a class called Tech, Media, and Democracy, where we look at issues at that intersection. And it's a kind of hands-on course where students are kind of immersed in questions and challenges to the information environment, information ecosystem, if you will. And then they also kind of build either investigations or prototypes of new digital media concepts that test questions at that intersection of tech, media, and democracy. And I've been doing this now for, well, it's closing in on a decade. And sometime along the way, I decided that focusing on this particular issue is what I want to do with the rest of my career. And so at the time, Tech Policy Press, it was under a different name. It was a kind of a side hustle that myself and my co-founder sort of had put together. And around the time of COVID, I decided to put my full effort into it. And so for the last, now 6 years, I've been running Tech Policy Press and building it up as a publishing enterprise effectively and a community that focuses on a range of issues. And I'll just give you a little background on it and how it works. We are a charity. We're a 501c3, not-for-profit corporation. There are 5 of us full-time in New York, in Amsterdam, in North Carolina, and in Washington, D.C. We have a fellowship program, which is, I hesitate to say they're all mid-career, but I think it's kind of like a mid-career fellowship program for journalists and researchers who focus on tech policy issues. And we have a handful of contributors spread out around the world, our contributing editors. And then our model very much relies on volunteer contributions from folks like your colleagues there at Berkman Klein. Valerie mentioned we've had many submissions across the years from Berkman Klein in particular, and we love to publish work from effectively folks who are expert in their field and are engaging on policy matters. And so that's been a great privilege over the years to publish so many folks from there. And I'll just step back for a second and talk a little bit about kind of big picture. And I hope you can see this. I don't know if you can or not, if it's readable. Hopefully it is good. Maybe someone's seen this slide before or this chart. But if you haven't, this is actually an image that someone at the World Economic Forum put together. And say what you will about the folks at Davos. They put together this graphic to sort of illustrate a concept that's been around for a few decades, the idea of the quote unquote polycrisis. This is the notion that humanity faces a series of interlinked crises that interact with one another and which are to some extent either correlated or causally linked in some ways. And this is a kind of way of thinking about complexity, thinking about global risk, thinking about the challenges that we face. And I guess it was a couple years ago now, I saw Dr. Alondra Nelson, who some of you may be familiar with, a scholar, previously was at the Office of Science and Technology Policy under the Biden administration. And she was talking about this graphic, and talking about, all of the challenges that we face, across the globe. And one thing she kind of pointed out was, when you look at this thing and you kind of think about it through the lens of technology and technology policy, it's sort of interesting, like that these tech issues are sort of, they're kind of in this upper left hand corner. They're sort of separated off, apart from these other types of issues around environment and public health and geopolitical conflict and the rest of that. So they're depicted almost as sort of separate nodes, and in a way, off in their own neighborhood. And I remember Dr. Nelson more or less saying that this doesn't seem quite right, to those of us who think about tech and tech issues. In many ways, the technology issues are themselves a kind of medium. They are underneath or interact with or reflexively connected to many of these other items in the broader set of crises that we face. And so when you think about frontier technologies, which we might include artificial intelligence in, when you think about issues around digital power concentration, when you think about cybercrime and security, or issues around social media, misinformation, disinformation, these all have close relationships in many ways to some of the broader challenges that we face. And so her perspective is kind of, you kind of have to think about technology maybe a little bit differently, almost as if it's in front of or behind the rest of these nodes. And that in some ways, it's not right to see it as its own sort of thing. And I kind of think that way too. I mean, that's sort of the way I think about technology, tech policy, why it's so important, because it does have downstream impacts on so many other issues. When you really zoom out and you think about what we're doing here with technology, the idea that we have more or less connected for the first time billions of humans across borders, across certainly political jurisdictions, across all manner of kind of economic and social demographics. Something very, from at a species level, we've done something very novel just in the last few years. And that's, as Valerie said, things are moving very quickly. It seems to be that, now we're introducing artificial intelligence. And instead of that rollout of that new technology taking, months or years, a company can publish a new frontier model and it's instantly available to millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of people. I was just reading a statistic yesterday associated with the AI summit that's happening right now in India, that, in India, there are more than 100 million ChatGPT users. So you're able to scale the dispersal of this technology, the adoption of this technology immensely, and very, very quickly. And I think that's interesting to think about. What does that mean for the way we organize ourselves? What does it mean for the way we think about collective behavior, how we arrive at consensus, how we come at problems? We've got a lot of big problems which are depicted on this chart. And to some extent, all of the questions around technology are questions about how we make rules, how we go about organizing ourselves and solving problems in that broader context. So that's sort of how I think of our purpose. We're working on all of these problems on some level by working on this intersection of tech and democracy, this point of intersection, which is setting the rules for how we solve many, many other problems. And I think that we're also doing that, of course, in a context where the value and even the notion of democracy as a form of governance is not necessarily a shared value across the world. We're in the middle of a kind of 2 decade or longer decline in democracy. More people are living under authoritarian circumstances than are not. That number keeps growing. There are major challenges to internet freedom and free expression, major challenges that we'll face together over the years in terms of concentrations of power, both within governments, but also within corporations. Really a lot to work on here. So I generally have the view that I'm certainly not, going to solve this, certainly not by myself. And none of us here by ourselves are going to be able to address this. This is a massive interconnected set of issues, and it needs lots of people from lots of disciplines with lots of perspectives and lots of different value systems and ways of looking at things to really continue to just crack problems. I do problem definition, offer solutions, test policy concepts, see what works, see what doesn't, do science to provide the evidence that can lead us forward. All of those things, make smart arguments, recognize when we've won an argument, when we've lost one, and try to move forward collectively. So I'm effectively excited to welcome you into that community. You're already in it very much, right? In what you're doing there in your program. And I think that for those of you who go on to work in the field, what I think of as the field of people who work on issues at the intersection of tech and society or tech and democracy, it's important that we kind of establish connections, build relationships, build networks, because that's the only way we're going to ever get at some of these problems. So we've got a range of different editorial priorities. These are the 6 that are listed on our website. And, concentrations of power, I think that's an important one. We're skeptical both of concentrations of power in corporations, but also in government. We're always looking for constraints on power. And in many ways, that's crucial for democracy. If you think about the United States and how it was established, essentially with this notion of checks and balances on the power of various branches of government in order to maintain essentially rule by the people. And that is something that's certainly under threat at the moment in different ways. We're thinking about geopolitics. We're thinking about impacts of tech on the economy. This is a very hot one right now, and AI is driving this right to the fore. And it very much is kind of at the center of the topic that we're going to be working on in this project. The questions around, the future of labor, future of education. Then, of course, we're concerned with how tech exacerbates or solves various types of problems in society, specifically ones that impact participation in democracy. So racism, bigotry, violence, oppression. Concerned, of course, about the ethics of tech, and then the mechanics of democracy, election integrity and participation. And I would include in that also concerns about information integrity and journalism, and how those play an important role in democracy as well, and how they interact with technology. So, if you go to Tech Policy Press on any given day, you'll encounter various slices of these issues, people working on maybe very specific things. Maybe they're concerned with how some piece of European regulation is playing out, or they're concerned with some move by the Trump administration, or they're concerned with, child online safety or what have you. But generally, you can connect those things back all to this rubric. What we're trying to do more or less is help our readers see around the corner. I tend to think that our readers are global. They often have, maybe even lived across borders or traveled. They're thinking globally about these issues. They're often operating in communities that are global. And we want to kind of give them a layer of intelligence and also give them exposure to new ideas and voices. And you all are going to help to generate new ideas, and you all are new voices to join this tech policy discourse. And then another big thing we're trying to do is reduce asymmetry of information. In this space, there's a lot of data and information that's held either by corporations or by governments. It's not accessible to advocates or journalists. And one of our goals is to try to reduce that asymmetry, make it possible for there to be a better discourse around these issues, and to level up the playing field. And then a big piece of this is creating connections. And that's one thing that I really appreciate is when people are able to form connections and create opportunities for themselves out of the work they do. I do hear quite a lot from people. In fact, I was talking to someone this morning who will point to something they wrote on Tech Policy Press, opening a door for them, helping them get a meeting, serving as a talking point in an interview, whatever it might be. Those types of connections are very valuable. And hopefully, if you engage in this, it's something that may be possible for you too. Okay, I'm going to shift gears just for a minute. And I'm going to talk about some basic things that we see as important in writing op-eds or analytical opinion pieces, which I suspect many of these pieces will take this kind of form. You're going to be commenting on what you're seeing around you. You're going to be trying to analyze some corpus of information, which could be your own observation. It could be data that you collect in some way. It could be research that you do. It could be a corpus of secondary resources you're going to reference, whatever it might be. But there are some tips. And I would just say that not all these ideas come from us. I've drawn from a few different sources with this, including Harvard. So I'll kind of go through these really quickly. But if you look at the Washington Post's guide to writing an opinion, which no matter what you might think of the opinion section at the Washington Post and where it's headed under another tech billionaire, Jeff Bezos, the general kind of ideas that they express are, I think, fairly useful. And some of this might look like, essay writing 101, going back to, the first theme you were assigned in middle school or what have you. But on some level, there's a reason that people stick with that type of structure. It's because it works. Thinking about how to structure an argument, making sure that there's a clear statement of thesis or problem that you intend to address or resolve in your writing, being reasoned in terms of how you present your argument, and then thinking about where you're going to leave the reader is often very important. I tend to try to think of every piece we do as somewhat of a little journey. If a reader spends, a few minutes with a 1,000-word essay or a 2,000-word, analysis piece, where are you taking them? Why should they engage with it? Why should they spend their time on it? We're all extremely time crunched at this point. People don't commit to something if they don't know what the payoff will be. So how do we kind of get the bottom line up front in a way that makes the reader understand, where we're going, what the logical flow will be? So those things are important. And the folks at the Post have laid out various reasons that you might write, right? You may want to help people more deeply understand a topic, understand what it means for them, equip them with arguments they can employ, elevate ideas that might help them think about the world differently. Of course, expose them to topics they might not have heard about or articulate a perspective. And here, I think we're particularly interested in perspective and in your perspectives. And as Valerie mentioned, we're doing this in part because we think that you have something to tell us. You are living through something that is probably very certainly happening around you every day on some level, which is that you're seeing the impact of this, new technology in an educational context, in a labor context, in a relational context, and in many ways, you're making decisions about how you engage with this stuff in your own life and in your own work and your own education. And I think you may have some useful things to tell those of us who are in a different place in our lives about what that experience is like. So, pardon me, I'm very grateful for your perspective in particular. Main thing to think through, and I think this will come through in the judging process as well, is that we want to see a clear thesis, something that we can point to and say we understand, what this is about. And I would urge you, in this type of writing, it is a little different from academic writing, right? Often academics will do the long wind up, right? Let's go ahead and wind this up. Let's establish all the priors. Let's get everything on the table that is known about this thing, and then we'll tell you what in fact we might like to do to uh, add to that body of knowledge. That tends to be the wrong way around for us. We don't want to start there. In fact, in most of the time, that type of approach, while it works in academic journals where you're attempting to kind of create a contextual understanding or a reference to prior work, or to locate your work in a larger body of work, that type of thing. What it often means is that you have to state a lot of things that may be obvious or already well known. And so we tend to try to avoid that type of thing. One way around that sometimes is to think about the takeaway and start there. How might that be the headline for the piece? How might that be, your first sentence, that bottom line up front sentence? And while it might seem a little bit, reductive, sometimes it really can be useful to think about the very short elevator version of your piece. How would you explain it in a sentence or two to others? And sometimes that explanation can be the place to start. Another kind of thought, and I think by the way, this one comes from I can't remember quite where I pulled this. I think this might be Foreign Affairs. I like this idea of being timely or timeless. I suspect that most of the things that will do well in this will have some aspect of timely. They'll be tied to things that are happening. But often when you're writing in this way analytically, there's kind of two ways you can go about it. One is you can tie it to something that's happening right now, tie it to a topic, an incident, an occasion, an event, and connect it to that thing. That is often a very attractive way to go, and increasingly on Tech Policy Press, certainly, I would say 75% of what we do is timely, and our goal is to always take things that may not be as timely and to look for opportunities for them to be. Sometimes that happens very naturally. You'll be working on something, and then a hook occurs. That will often happen. A piece of legislation passes, or an executive says something, or another event occurs in the world. But it's also possible to be timeless, just to address a big topic, and to look at it analytically, potentially with evidence that may not be tied to the moment, but may have accrued over time. So there's no particular rule there, but I would say that we do have a slight preference for things that are timely rather than timeless. And in general, like even beyond this project, as you go out into the world, I would say that if you're trying to do writing in the public domain, you're pitching to other publications, maybe op-eds to newspapers, you want to kind of get across. Timing is truly essential, and it's hard sometimes to communicate exactly what type of urgency I mean when I'm talking to academics, because typically they operate on a slightly different time scale, and that's fine. It's totally appropriate that there is a group of people who are not driven by news cycles. But if you do want to engage with more timely news media in on a news cycle kind of time frame, then minutes, hours can matter on some level, and you never know. I'll just give you one example over the holidays this year, there was, the first reports of what eventually became an international scandal around Grok and the platform X, which was essentially at great scale responding to user prompts to undress photos, mostly of women, but unfortunately also in some cases of children. And those photos were automatically published to X. And journalists started to notice this, researchers, and it became very quickly, right after the holiday, a sort of, focus for both regulators and for journalists. We did a piece with a researcher called Rihanna Pfefferkorn, who's at Stanford and works on policy there. And it came out at just the very beginning of the cycle on Grok and X and this particular phenomenon. That particular piece went on to get cited by a bunch of folks. It led to Rihanna being a go-to source in the news media on the issue. She ended up, on various broadcast media, including television and NPR. She ended up with an op-ed in the New York Times as a result. And I would say that effectively her timing was perfect. Of course, she already knew these issues in and out. She had her expertise, but she literally got off the couch during the holiday and said, I see the news cycle here. I see the cycle happening, and I want to take advantage of it. I'm going to get out there. We were happy to help her do that, of course. And her hard work paid off, and she was, very much able to, I think, influence the debate on this issue. So that's a good one. If you look at your colleagues over at Harvard Kennedy School, they have some good advice on how to do good writing about policy, and some of it echoes the Washington Post. A lot of focus on this idea of the opening, right? Grabbing people at the beginning, having a hook that grabs readers' attention with a strong claim, a surprising fact, a metaphor, a mystery, a counterintuitive observation. These types of things do tend to work, and I would encourage you to think that way. That in some ways does ask you to be a storyteller, a narrative thinker. How are you going to grab a reader's attention and then take them through? I'm sure all of you can think of a book you've read where it's literally the first line, right, that had you hooked, that got you. And if anybody has one, maybe during the Q&A, we can kind of go through that. And then, thinking about how to build in some other elements, right? Aspects of echoing or answering your introduction, and then how maybe to lead to some kind of what we call in the business the kicker, right? A last or memorable detail, something that you're going to leave the reader with. Might be a call to action, might be an anecdote, might be something that takes us to the next level or invites us to have a deeper conversation with others or with ourselves about what we've just read. Okay. And I'll just say, you can spend a lot of time on our site, looking at different pieces. You're going to find all manner of things. We have a range of different types of material. I suspect most of what is submitted in this contest will be what we refer to as perspective, meaning that, it will be through your lens, through the perspective, through your perspective, and will be effectively opinion, but analytical opinion. We also publish what we call analysis, and some of you may submit that. Analysis tends to be, it's a Venn diagram on some level, but it's less about emphasizing the perspective of the writer and more about looking at some body of facts or some set of trends or some trajectory of an issue, and doing so in a slightly clinical way. So I think most of what you'll do will be perspective, but some of you may take an analytical approach as well. And I can talk a little bit more about the distinction if that's useful. But I look at a person like Emily Tucker, who's the executive director at the Center on Privacy and Technology at Georgetown Law. Um, she writes, I think, very, very, very well. She, always has, kind of deep thoughts, well expressed, and does, I think, a very nice job of bringing the reader in and then taking them through often complicated material, but in reasonably simple language. And there's a kind of authority and voice in what Emily writes that I think are important. We also publish other things, and some of your pieces may look more like this. This is a more analysis driven piece that we did recently. Ultimately, we branded it Perspective because it came with a set of recommendations, policy prescriptions, things that should happen. But this is an example of a project that actually looked at a set of data. It was almost what you might call a kind of investigation. This group of authors had looked at a data set, they had conducted their own analysis, and then they had drawn recommendations from it. Some of you may have access to information, to data, or you may collect data for this, or you may propose to collect data for this. I don't know exactly what I mean by that. It could be observational information. It could be some corpus of information about. It could be something else. That's always interesting to us. And so if you end up kind of going that route, we'll be quite pleased to see that work as well. And then I'll throw this one out here as well. Eric Salvaggio was one of our fellows last year. He's now getting a PhD in Cambridge, and the other Cambridge. And he, has a good way, I think, of kind of both mastering the timing on things, but also kind of giving readers a conceptual framework, a way to think about something. He's quite good at this. He published this piece was last year. It's probably one of the best read pieces of the year last year. And the timing of it was just right. It was just after the start of the second Trump administration, the beginnings of the Department of Government Efficiency, Elon Musk wading into the government and, summarily firing huge swaths of government agencies, shutting down USAID, the rest of that. And a big piece of that, of course, was about pushing artificial intelligence as an alternative. And Eric has been thinking about these issues for a long time, been thinking about how AI is used in government and public contexts. And he came along with this piece, which was this sort of like analytical piece that he called Anatomy of an AI Coup. And it came along again, just right in the cycle, ended up being referenced in the Atlantic and the New Yorker and the New York Times and a bunch of other places because he got it just right at the right moment, or he gave people a way of thinking about something that was useful. So not everyone will be able to do this, but if you can, it's a masterful thing to be able to do, to spot something that's happening for which we don't seem to have exactly the right language, and to provide some framing or rubric or conceptualization of it that helps people, put the pieces together in their own minds. So that's just a bit of a challenge. So I'm going to stop here in just a second and take questions, etc. But I'm very excited about this. When we've been talking about the topic, I think, when we were talking about the topic, this was even before the holidays. I don't even think we quite knew where we'd be now in February of 2026. How quick AI is moving generally, how quickly the vibe is shifting around conversations around artificial intelligence, even in tech critical communities. Something very definitely has changed just in the last 3 months with agentic systems and the Claude Code phenomena, weirder phenomena like Moldbook or Claudebot, whatever you want to call those things, these unrestrained agents. There's a lot happening. And I think that the dialogue about generative AI and about AI more generally seems to be going through a real kind of vibe shift moment. Some people are not convinced by past criticisms. They are looking at what AI systems are capable of, and they're asking, whether those past criticisms are up to the challenge of helping us get to the next stage of tech criticism. Others, maintain that we're really veering in an incredibly dangerous direction on a variety of different fronts, and that we need to preserve even, venues for thinking about refusal of artificial intelligence. Even as others, I think, are trying to think about, given the set of circumstances in the world we're in, how do we think through ways to minimize the risks of adoption? So I will take perspectives across a broad spectrum there. You don't have to be pro AI in order to write for Tech Policy Press. In fact, most people who are writing for us are what I would say are critical. And critical and skeptical are different words. But some degree of skepticism, some degree of critical approach is always very valuable. We shy from hype. We don't tend to like to engage in hype. With AI in particular, we follow a bunch of different rules, but we try not to anthropomorphize AI systems. We try not to grant them powers that they don't have. We try not to, go beyond scientific consensus on whether these systems are, for instance, a form of intelligence. They're not, or other things of that sort. So we're looking for clear thinking, and for thinking that is from a kind of critical place. But you don't have to necessarily have a pro AI or anti AI perspective. I don't think it necessarily needs to be such a binary. And wherever you end up in your own kind of perspective on these matters, that's going to be based on your background, your perspective, your experience, what you want to see happen in the world, all of those things. So there's no priors for us in terms of the types of pieces that we're going to look at. Ultimately, we want to know, what you think, and we want your best effort at expressing yourself. Okay, so I think that might be this might be the last slide, which is just some things to think about. How many big ideas, conceptual frameworks, or other intellectual signals are in your piece? I would argue, don't overload it. Go for clarity. We're not trying to make this a citation. You're not going to win points for, referencing every thinker or critic or possible conceptual framework or rubric that exists in the world to look at your particular problem. Think about whether there's a call to action or some other way that the reader might engage with the problem, or maybe some recommendation you have about what should be done to further study the issue, or how you intend to further study it. And then, where you can, do bring in some other voices, right? That helps to signal both the kind of tradition or the discipline you're coming from. And then we're very keen these days, any, maps, bullets, numbers, charts, data visualizations, other things that are useful for expressing your ideas. You don't have to, I think, in the process of doing this, necessarily create those, but if you have an idea, we'd like to know what it is. And then just always think about the bottom line. My hope is that, to some extent, these essays, they'll be little time capsules of perspectives at the start of something. I mean, I do think on some level this is the start of something. I don't mean to hype it either, but I do think this is a moment very similar to perhaps the beginning of the internet or the beginning of social media, where something has shifted in the ways that we access, structure, exchange information. and we're going to be living with that for some time. And so all of these essays will eventually be time capsules, not only of your perspective, given where you are in your education, your career, your life, but also a time capsule of where we are, with the technology and with society's adoption and handling of it. So, leave us with that bottom line. What is that perspective at the moment? Okay, I think that's all. My email's here. And if I'm ever useful to you outside this contest, there it is. But I'm happy to take some questions. Hopefully that didn't go on too long, Valerie. I hope not.
Yes, thank you. We'll take about 5 to 10 minutes for questions about the contest, and then we'll transition into the writing gym. Thank you so much, Justin. Just a quick round of applause for Justin.
Thank you.
I really like what you said earlier, talking about timeless versus timely, and then really referring to it as a time capsule. I think it's a really exciting time. Even as we've talked about programming here, just how fast things have changed. So to be able to document it, have it somewhere, not only for the world, but also as something for you as well. So I will stop there so we can ask our questions. What questions do people have? I'm going to hand the mic over. Remember, this is being recorded, so you don't have to say your name, but just know that this is being recorded for later usage.
Hi, thank you so much. I just had a quick question on sources. Are we able to interview people for this essay? And if so, what are the guidelines or standards for that?
You mean in terms of documenting your interviews?
For like conducting an interview or like protocols for how to quote or cite people?
Yeah, that's a good question.
In the AI space.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would, if you're asking about this through the lens of, do I need an IRB or something? Is that kind of what you mean, or?
I don't have any particular connotation for asking, but like, for instance, if I wanted to speak with like a CS professor on their thoughts on this particular angle on AI, and I wanted to quote them, is there anything that I should be considering outside of, just quoting them the way I might do so?
Yeah, I mean, I think any of the work you're going to do for us, I guess I was jumping to the conclusion you might be asking, like, from like a human subjects lens. Most of the time, this type of writing, this type of work is deemed kind of journalistic. And so when you're asking people about their experiences or about their expertise, you don't need any kind of, review of that. So I maybe put that to the side, since I don't think it's where your question's coming from. But yeah, you're welcome to interview people and you're welcome to quote people. And you should obviously follow general best practice on that. I would, recommend that obviously, if you're going to interview someone, you could either take contemporaneous notes or record it. And if you're ever concerned about the context in which you're, portraying a quote, you can always check it with the person you're quoting and tell them your intent. And if in fact, they have some issue with it, you could take it up with them at that time. Generally, that's not a problem. Not with this type of material. The only place you should be concerned, of course, and which we as editors will help you with when you bring us material like this, is if you are in fact quoting someone in a critical way, right? And maybe there's a reading of the quotation that could be seen as perhaps damaging to their interests or their reputation or what have you. I don't think this project is designed around that type of work. It's not really designed to have you go be muckrackers, and go dig up dirt on or directly challenge your professors, in some kind of less than collegial way or what have you. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. But 100%, we love it when people are bringing quotes from external experts or from others. Did that more or less answer what you were hoping for there?
Yeah.
There's head shaking here, so yes.
Okay.
Other questions?
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. I'm curious, two questions. One on the audience for this. I know obviously the people who are reading Tech Policy Press are a little bit more familiar with the tech landscape. What level of knowledge do you assume for your audience, and then how do you write pieces according to that?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll let you do that one first.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, the way this is particularly important when it comes to kind of technical content and material. So, I mean, I don't know, somebody might really take the angle on agentic AI and want to go deep into that somehow or what have you. I think what we always try to do is obviously assume the reader is generally aware of issues and ideas in the field, because it isn't a common, a more generalist audience, a lay audience. It is an audience of people who are coming to Tech Policy Press. We know that most of our readers are working on tech policy in some way professionally. They might be people who are, literally holding a policy position in a corporation or working in a government or a regulator. They might also be working in civil society, or they're a researcher who studies these issues. But we do have a significant number of people who I think of as interested general public, a lay audience that's compelled by this. But what I try to sort of say is, write like you're, writing for a smart friend who may not read all the same things you read every day. They may not be aware of the jargon in your particular area of interest. They may not know exactly how some piece of technology works. They don't need to be handheld. You don't have to, dumb it down. But you may want to make sure you include some basics just so your thinking is clear, your writing is clear. Jargon, of course, that we tend to try to strike. We don't like it when people introduce new terms, which happens a lot around writing around AI, where people, introduce some new term that for whatever reason they apply capital letters to. We don't like, little abbreviations that people have begun to adopt. We strike, for instance, Gen AI wherever possible. Things of that nature. So I don't know, that's maybe a little too specific, but what I would say in general is, yeah, think about you're writing for an expert, a generally expert audience, but they may not share your exact expertise or your exact perspective. So you do have to dial the knob to general a bit, but not as far as you might have to go. For instance, if you were going to be writing for the New York Times readership or something like that, that may come down to how you have to explain certain concepts. Like, for instance, something like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which appears on our pages all the time. We don't feel the need to explain the intricacies of that or exactly what it is every time. Most readers are aware generally of a concept like that. Hopefully that answered your question.
I think we can do one. Did you have another question, or
Somebody else.
we can do one more question if somebody has it? We also have some general FAQs on the website as well.
I do have no.
Okay.
Time.
Sure, we can do one more.
I'm curious if you can give us a little bit more context on what you think is a tech policy piece that would be published by your outlet as compared to maybe the Washington Post or New York Times. Are there particular differences with how we should approach an op-ed for your outlet compared to maybe another news source?
I mean, frequently, by the way, just today there's a piece in the Times about the I'm not saying this to brag. We're a specialist publication. Of course, we would cover these things differently. But there's a piece in the Times about, for instance, how Europe and the U.S. are having a row over tech regulation. And we've been covering that in and out and the specifics of that for, I don't know, years. So I guess the difference is like that piece that they're portraying there is it's written for a more generalist audience. It explains the broad contours of the issues. It kind of situates it among just the largest, biggest actors in that particular conflict. Whereas we've been going quite deep on it, in many different ways for a really long time. And to some extent, that's for a reason, right? The median Times reader or average Times reader doesn't need that level of detail to be informed about what's happening between the U.S. and Brussels when it comes to digital regulation. But our audience, wants the specifics. They want a little bit more detail, and they want the technical questions. They're more interested in, the finer questions of it. So whereas like the New York Times might publish a piece that says, the European Commission has fined X 120 million euros for these reasons, right? We're going to go deep into that. We're going to say, well, let's look deeply at the decision. What does it exactly say about how the European Commission is applying the Digital Services Act? What does it exactly say about, potentially the future of research access to platform data, which is one of the issues that, the fine was based on. X was not compliant with the Digital Services Act's rule set around that. We're going to go at that level deeper into things because that's where our audience is. They're sweating the details on some level. And the details are often where there are important points of intervention. I'll say that too, I guess. The Times reader who reads that big piece is probably not thinking to themselves like, oh, I'm going to figure out how to engage in this particular issue. Most of them, they're not thinking like, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and do my own analysis or pick off a piece of this and go do my own work on it. Or I'm going to go and have a conversation with another set of experts. Our readers are doing that. They're people who often take and actualize the information that they have. They share that information. They cite it. They include it in a report, that type of thing. And I will say, you just never know where yourself will end up. And maybe this is important in this context. I just wrote an email a couple of weeks ago to a graduate student at Duke who had written a piece for us last year to tell her that I just cited a citation of her piece in a White House report on AI and the future of the economy, which she was quite surprised to see, but that piece of information seemed relevant to someone in the I think the Office of Science and Technology Policy to cite in this piece that they were publishing on the disruption that's ahead from artificial intelligence. So, that's often, our readers are often looking to operationalize the information that they come across on our pages in a way. So we think of it like that, like it's building blocks. It's not just, news for a general audience that I'll read and maybe think about momentarily and then move on from.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody, for your questions. Just to wrap up, again, you can get more information about the contest on our page. If you go onto the left side of programs, there's the student essay contest for spring. Justin went through some of the tech policy press writing priorities, but if you scroll down, these are the essay submissions that we're going to be covering because they overlap with BKC as well. So I encourage you to look at these. Our next activity we'll be looking at this a little bit more closely. And if you look here on the right side, it has that application where you'll actually submit that, and including the FAQs. And we can take some of the FAQs that were also here and incorporate that into our FAQs as well. So with that being said, thanks again, Justin, for being here today. We really appreciate your time and your care into sharing more about Tech Policy Press and the general audience. And we look forward to seeing what comes of this.
Hey, listen, thank you and everybody there, Alex and Tony. I just grateful to everybody who's put this together. So excited about this. And I'll just say, no matter what happens with this, right, consider the door open at Tech Policy Press. Send us, we have, we accept contributions all the time. So once this is through, later in your career, later in your life, whatever, if there's reason for you to be in touch, consider yourself, invited. And I'll just once again encourage you all. It is a crazy time. You're gonna finish your studies and graduate into, one of the more topsy turvy periods that anyone can remember. I think, short of like wartime, frankly. So it is an extraordinary moment, and I'm glad to be able to benefit from your best thinking and your perspectives. And I think our readers will benefit from it too. So grateful to you.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate it.
Have a good day.
Thank you. You as well. Bye-bye, Justin.
Bye.